Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Assistant Professor of Communication and Media at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on Twitter at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. It's been a hot minute since our last podcast release due to some scheduling issues, but those are all sorted now. And I've got the next 5 or 6 guests lined up for the show. And I am super stoked about the content we're going to be talking about. So I put out a newsletter outlining who those guests will be. But if you missed it, you can check the link in the episode description to find out what's coming up in the next couple months. But it feels great to be back behind the mic. And what better way to revamp than by talking about social media influencers and their role in political campaigns. Super hot topic, and who better to tell us about it than Madeline Twomey. She is the president of Rufus & Main, a boutique digital consulting firm for progressive organizations and funders, and she recently served as community content director for Biden for President and director of digital partnerships for the 59th Presidential Inauguration Committee. So Madeline is really one of the pioneers forging these relationships between social media influencers and political campaigns, and she recently wrote about some of her best practices in a Medium post that I'll link to in the show notes and reference during the interview. But this type of relationship is something that hasn't happened so much in the past, and definitely not at the level of professionalization as it has in the most recent Biden campaign. And it's still something that's quite early for campaigns. So it's really interesting to get these insights now as this practice is emerging and may develop more in the future. And it's important to clarify what type of influencers are we talking about. In the interview, we don't get so much into platform-specific talk, but clearly the mind goes to Instagram. But Madeline told me off the air that it's more about the person themselves, the influencer, because if they are an influencer, they have an audience across multiple platforms. So she mentioned YouTube and TikTok being particularly important, as well as Instagram. So I just wanted to clarify that we're talking about influencers really from a cross-platform perspective, which I think is really how campaigns are looking at it, rather than any one particular platform. But we get into looking at how do different audience sizes of influencers matter. How do campaigns work with influencers to get them talking about politics if their brand is built around something non-political like food or fitness? And overall, how do these relationships work between social media influencers and political campaigns? I think it's super interesting, and I hope y'all enjoy it. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Madeline Twomey. Again, she is the president at Rufus & Main. Madeline, thanks so much for taking the time out, and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here, Michael.
So before we get into the ins and outs of influencer programs, why don't we set the stage a bit by talking about your recent experience with the Biden campaign and his inauguration? What were your roles there, and how did influencers come into the mix?
Yeah, of course. So on the Biden campaign, my title was the community content director. So effectively, I was tasked with, engaging various communities online, kind of exactly what it says. I was a part of the digital partnerships team, which was kind of like the innovation hub of the digital team on the campaign. So we were tasked with seeding content about Joe Biden on the internet anywhere that wasn't through our own channels. So whether that was through publishers or different platforms or different partnerships, anything that wasn't like our social media or our email or our advertising. So influencers played a big role in that. I also headed up the digital partnerships team during the inauguration, which I might refer to as PIC, the Presidential Inaugural Committee. And there we also utilized influencers. So in both cases, we really utilized them as kind of an external messenger or an external channel for our broader goals.
And is this focus on influencers, something that really came about this election cycle, or really became more sort of professionalized this election cycle? Or have you also seen it in the prior work on campaigns you've done?
Yeah. So I do think that, the Hillary campaign in 2016 did dabble in this space. So definitely want to give them credit for that. And then the DCCC did a very small GOTV program, Get Out the Vote program, in the 2018 cycle, really in like the last few days of the election. But it's really funny because during the 2018 cycle, I remember I just became really obsessed with this idea and was just like, I mean, literally obsessed with it. And I remember I was interviewing for a job and the person asked me, what do you think is like the number one innovation or the number one thing that teams should be focused on this cycle? And I said, influencers. Like, we need to be tapping into this community. It's how products are being sold, it's how people, consume the internet right now is through influencers and their relationships with them. And I didn't get the job, and no one really did it, with the exception of, like I said, the DCCC. So coming out of the 2018 cycle and early 2019, again, this was still very much on my mind. So I was really thrilled to be able to do it with some organizations before the Biden campaign and then also bring it to the Biden campaign as well.
Cool. Yeah. Because I mean, also here in the EU, there's tons of interest in leveraging influencers to promote political candidates and causes. And you make a really interesting comparison in your Medium piece between influencer programs and digital organizing programs. So, in your view, how are influencer programs and digital organizing programs similar? And what are some of the key benefits that influencers offer to a political campaign versus the average volunteer?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think in the broadest sense of a digital organizing program, really what you're doing, and this is true with organizing programs too, right? And the difference is just one, you're doing it in person versus online. But in a digital organizing program, you're finding your supporters online, you're organizing them, or if they're already organized, into a community online, whether a Facebook group or something, you're kind of tapping into those communities. You develop relationships with those people, and then eventually you start making asks of them. And the idea, whether it's volunteering or donating or, sharing things on their social profiles and hoping that they also then engage their communities. So we kind of call this like the snowflake model, because every person that is in the, organizing model touches more and more people and brings them into the fold. So all of those things are true of influencer programs too, right? It's about finding your supporters online, developing relationships with them, and working with them to craft messages that they can share online or making specific asks of them. And sometimes that's them sharing on their social profiles, but we also utilize influencers in other ways too. So to me, they really are the same. And I think, you could argue that an influencer program is really just a part of a really strong digital organizing program.
Yeah, that's interesting because I wanted to ask you about what type of social media influencers we're talking about, particularly in terms of audience size, because that's one of the key kind of metrics that defines an influencer, right? And in your Medium piece, you mentioned different levels of influencers, such as mid-tier and micro influencers. So could you outline those different levels of influencers for us, and what might those differences in audience size mean for their role in a campaign?
Yeah, definitely. So people might define these slightly different, but I think like in broad strokes, what I'm about to say will hold true. So nano influencers are folks with about 1,000 followers, so kind of in that smaller tier. Micro influencers get you into that 10 to 20,000 range, and then mid tier, 50 to let's say 500,000. I usually say it's like around 150, 150,000, because it's interesting that I've tended to see that influencers' followers tend to kind of plateau. So you have like a lot of folks that tend to fall into certain numbers, and then their growth between those kind of tiers tends to be really fast. So that's always interesting. Macro influencers are really in the like 1 million range. And then anyone else beyond that, those are kind of like the mega folks if we're talking multi millions.
Mm. And is there, in terms of interacting with these influencers, I mean, I'd assume that the higher up they are on the influencer chain, they're harder to get in contact with. But are they more like, whales for a campaign, that those would be super, super useful? Or is it those that have smaller numbers of followers fill a different function?
Yeah. So on the campaign and then during the inauguration, we kind of separated the workflow into two different tiers. So it's kind of like small and large. So really like the million plus category or slightly under that. And then everyone else below that was, on the smaller end. And we separated those work streams because, to your point, we did find that the way that we interacted with those different influencers, or the way that I guess they expected to be interacted with, it varied. So for the smaller folks, and small again, like, some of these people have 500,000 followers, so they're not small by any means. But for the smaller folks, we were able to, I think, activate them more on the day to day. So telling them about days of action or, specific kind of like messaging pushes. And we were able to see a better response rate with those kinds of asks or, here's a graphic around polling locations and when they're open on election day. And people would share that. Or, when we were doing like debate rapid response work, the larger influencers I think really expected more of like what we call like custom activations where, we're working one on one with them to figure out the best way to utilize them. So for a lot of those folks during the campaign, we actually did one on one sit downs with them and a member of the campaign. So we utilized, Joe Biden, Jill Biden, Simone Sanders was a senior advisor, and then also a lot of the Biden granddaughters. So they would have one on one conversations with these influencers and we would record them and the influencer would share it on their social channels. So that was kind of the difference between how we utilized them. I will say that I think both are important. Follower count isn't everything. And a lot of these smaller influencers do tend to have closer relationships with their followers and they have like a stronger connection with them because, there's fewer of them to connect with. So I think utilizing both in any program is really important.
That's interesting. So, would you say that again, with a broad brush, that the difference between the higher and lower tier would be some type of access? Because I think about influencers in the marketing space, right? They want some type of special access, whether that's to a club or to a product or something along those lines. And it seems like what you're saying is that by giving one-on-one time with someone in Joe Biden's sort of immediate orbit or someone from the campaign that may cater to that influencer's desire to have some type of special access by virtue of their huge following.
Yes, definitely. I think they expect that level of access, to be honest. And we were put in tough positions where getting time with any of the principals during the campaign was incredibly challenging for anything. They're the candidate and their families are just being pulled in a million different directions. So we had to tell folks no a lot, which was really tough. But I do think that larger folks, just yeah, to your point, expect that level of access. A lot of larger influencers do also have managers, and that, to your point about access too, can be challenging because sometimes you're working through their managers rather than with them directly. And I think that adds an additional layer of, just process.
Yeah, super interesting. And I mean, when you think about influencers, they can really vary widely in terms of what they're influencers of, which often can be a sort of niche topic or interest. So I'm curious, how do you actually find these influencers and what do you look for when considering who to partner up with?
Yeah. So we really worked with anyone and everyone, honestly. We weren't really looking at them from a topic area, to your point. We were more focused on reaching the communities that we cared about on the campaign. So, primarily for us, that was younger folks, communities of color, and in our swing states. So, we were looking for influencers that either, kind of fit that profile themselves or their following followed that profile. I would say in again, broad strokes, followers tend to kind of follow, the person that they're following. So if it's a female influencer, they're more likely to have, a high percentage of women followers. But that's not always true. So we did want to make sure to look at kind of both of those categories, the person themselves, but also their following and how it matched up with the audience that we were trying to reach. Yeah, mostly we really just wanted to work with people who wanted to work with us. And of course, again, strategically made sense with what we were trying to accomplish as we were getting closer and closer to the election. And during pick, I think one of the most interesting and fun things about it was that we were able to expand the influencers that we worked with because, we weren't focused on Colorado during the general election, but during pick, we could, tap influencers in states like that or, focus more on, California, New York, which is where a lot of influencers live, and tap into new communities that we weren't able to work with during the campaign.
Right. So if you're an influencer in a battleground state, you might be more likely to be contacted than if you were in a safe state.
Definitely. Yeah.
During the campaign, at least.
Yes.
So I'm sure it differs quite a bit for each case, but could you walk us through a typical example of how you'd onboard and start working with an influencer? Let's say to craft a get out the vote message towards the end of an election, for example.
hmm So before we did any like outreach, we spent a lot of time, one, just coming up with a list of, target influencers. And then also making sure that we really understood what we were going to ask them to be doing. We didn't want to start a relationship with someone and then they said, how can I help? And we're still scrambling to figure out exactly how they can plug in or what the best way for them to plug in was. So that's, the first piece of it. And then in the onboarding process itself, a lot of it was, just kind of cold outreach and going from there. I personally had calls with over 100 influencers in the onboarding process. So I should take a step back and say that on the campaign, it wasn't just me working with influencers. We had a couple other individuals who also worked with influencers, primarily Maha Gondor, Lorraine Carlucci, and Amelia Montooth. And so we were all doing influencer work together. And I primarily worked with micro influencers on the campaign itself. And during PIC, Maha and Lorraine were also a part of our PIC program. So we were able to continue that, our kind of workflows. But I personally had calls with over 100 influencers just in my kind of, segment of the program. And I think that was really valuable, despite it taking a lot of time in order to develop those relationships with individuals and really make sure that they felt comfortable with the asks, that I was walking them through it. And then, of course, I'd always send over follow-up materials. So if I was talking with like someone that I knew was a Biden supporter because they had already talked about it online, it was more about opening that relationship, opening that stream of communication, and making sure that they understood, the resources that we could offer them. So for example, if they're wondering where to tell people to get the most up-to-date information about how to vote, I would point them to our website and say, it's iwillvote.com. Here are the reasons why it's the best resource. It's the most up to date. We have a significant staff that's making sure that, anytime anything changes in one of the states, which it does often, we're reflecting that on our website. So, just making sure they're aware of resources like that. And then I'll say if they were not public Biden supporters at that point, the conversation looked a little bit different. And it was definitely more about, helping them get comfortable with the idea of talking about him publicly.
Yeah, that leads very well into my next question, which is about influencers who aren't explicitly political. I mean, a lot of influencers have their channels are built around food blogs or maybe fitness, and partisan politics might not resonate with their brand. So, how do you work with influencers to ensure that they're not going to divide or put off their audience by bringing politics into their typically non-political content?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, in my outreach or in my identification process, sometimes I'd identify people that I knew were talking publicly about social justice issues or had been talking about voting, but maybe, didn't talk about Democrats or Joe Biden in particular. But there were some other cues that suggested that they might be progressive. So I did a lot of outreach to folks like that. And if they responded and we set up time, I had an inclination that they were, probably Democrats and probably supported Joe Biden. So in those cases, yeah, it was really walking them through kind of what we were looking for. And for us, talking about Biden was really important. It wasn't just kind of these, go vote messages. It was really talking about why him and why he is the man for the moment and the right candidate. So a lot of the time it was kind of coaching them through how to talk about why they support Joe. So it wasn't ever, telling them what to say or anything like that. And we really wanted to make sure that the influencers were true to themselves, obviously, in that one, I think it's just the best way for them to then communicate with their followers. But secondly, we weren't interested in telling them what to say. But it was really coaching them through how to start talking about these issues that maybe they had never talked about on their profile. So, for example, if someone was a supporter of Joe Biden because they cared a lot about healthcare, I'd start to ask them questions about, okay, what is it about healthcare and his healthcare policy that's so important to you? And why does that lead you to vote for Joe or going to be voting for Joe? So it's kind of walking them through that process and really just allowing them to, I think, explore their own reasons why they were voting for him. We know that storytelling is like one of the most effective ways to communicate about the issues, that progressives care about, and that anything when it's personal to someone or we're talking about issues first, I think it opens the door more for that to be persuasive rather than just coming out right out of the gate and saying, Donald Trump is horrible and you should vote for Joe. Really making it more about, here are my morals, here are my values, here are the issues that I care about. And Joe is the answer because of that. So both, I think it's just like smart storytelling, but I think it's also, we actually like know that it's more likely to persuade people. So it was a really interesting process to get folks, to feel comfortable with having those conversations online. And I think it was really more about like helping them find their own personal narrative more than anything else.
Yeah, it makes me think about what you're saying about sort of having an idea whether someone's a Democrat or not. And I wonder if someday we'll see Instagram follower numbers make their way into a voter file, because you could, in theory, match basically individuals based on their social media profiles and scout out influencers that way.
Yeah, for sure. I think the other thing that a lot of folks were worried about, like in these onboarding conversations, was to your point, how do I start to talk about this issue I've never talked about before? But then also, I don't want to turn off followers or I don't want to open myself up to trolling. I think that was a real concern for a lot of people. Like a lot of these influencers they're pretty public people. So they get a lot of, negative messages already. So the idea of I think being bombarded with more negative comments, I'm sure can be really, take its toll. So I think again, encouraging people to lead with their values and things like that, I think that also kind of inoculates them against some of that trolling, right? It's not about party politics. It's about this is who I am as a person, and these are the issues that are important to me. And I think it's harder to come at someone for those kinds of opinions.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious if it seems like that's the majority of people that you've worked with, that they basically want to get into the political space, but they don't know how to do it. And they want to know the right way to craft that message for their audience. But I wonder if there is some sort of risk that, especially in this last election where, it was so much in the public debate, it was so highly polarized that influencers might use those sort of trending political topics as a way to either appeal to their audience or as a way to grow and expand their audience without necessarily being interested in the politics as such. Have you come across any of that? Or do you see that as a potential risk that people essentially use politics as a way to promote their brand rather than a sort of true expression of political interest?
Not really, honestly. I think we saw so much rejection in both on the campaign and then I think to a lesser degree on Pick, but we were turned down by so many influencers. I think just our experience alone just doesn't really support that. Some people, one, just, turned us down because they straight up were not a Joe Biden supporter. But a lot of people said, I do support you, but I'm not comfortable talking about it publicly. And again, sometimes I think I was able to get them more comfortable with the idea through those conversations, but sometimes it was just a non-starter for people. I think there are a lot of risks for influencers, quote unquote, coming out publicly about their political beliefs. And it's hard for me as someone that, doesn't do that as a job to kind of judge someone for making that choice. A lot of people, when they talk about politics, they lose followers. And if they rely on their follower count to get brand deals for their income, and for financial stability, I can understand why someone would be hesitant to do that. I do think that last year we saw more celebrities and influencers in some ways talking about politics more than ever. So I think we'll see less of that moving forward. And I hope that more and more people talk about these issues. But I do understand the risks and I understand why someone would make that choice. We worked with one influencer who was he actually, interesting that you talked about food. He was primarily a food blogger and, talked about food on his profile. And he started talking a lot about the election and Joe Biden before we, even had a conversation with him. And then we developed a relationship with him. And he would post and say, every time I talk about Joe, on his profile, every time I talk about Joe Biden, I lose followers. And, last night I lost X number of followers because of it. So he would kind of share that information and talk about it really publicly and say, I'm not doing this because it's beneficial to me. I'm doing this because I really care about this and I think it's the right thing to do. And he also would say, I don't care about losing those followers because if those people don't agree with, I think he would say, basic social justice issues, like then I don't want you in my community. So that's like the flip side, I think, to your question. And I think there are a lot of risks for influencers, but it was nice to see someone like him, taking those risks and talking publicly about it. As a result, he also changed the name of I don't think because of us, but he recently changed the name of his profile and, was kind of moving a little bit away from food and talking more about, here are the things that I care about. And politics, I think, is a big one for him. So that's been interesting to see too. The other thing is a lot of influencers don't even work with brands they don't love, So I think kind of the same for us too. They're not just going to support Joe Biden just because they think it's, commercially maybe the right thing to do. I don't think that's part of the calculus. At Pick, I will say it was a little bit different because we weren't really partisan, right? It was more about the moment in time, the more about like the transfer of democracy and power. And our theme was America United. It was about bringing people together and a celebration, and also, a moment of reflection on this past year, and moving forward together through this kind of painful moment. So it was interesting because we were able to bring on some influencers who, weren't interested in working with us during the campaign, but were a little bit more comfortable working with us during the inauguration.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how this unfolds because I wonder to what extent this election has been special and that people really felt the need in a lot of cases to sort of come out politically, even if it meant losing some of their followers. And maybe less elections will be less politically charged and influencers will be more risk averse in that sense. But it feels like there really was something special about this election that made people say, be damned with my audience size. This is something that I do want to use my platform for.
Definitely.
I wanted to ask you about different types of messaging. So, if you think about a campaign, right, they have a whole gamut of messages from persuasion to mobilization. And I'm wondering if influencers are more suited towards certain types of messages rather than others. I can imagine that an influencer would be good to promote things like voter registration or getting out the vote, because that's somewhat sort of pro-democracy and not necessarily partisan. Whereas maybe going fully on the attack, for example, might be something that would really put off someone's audience. So do you think that influencers are more suited towards certain types of messaging like voter mobilization rather than the more sort of partisan persuasion messaging?
I guess I would say I think influencers can really be utilized for any part of your campaign or program, to your point, whether it's persuasion or mobilization. I think it's more about, what they're comfortable doing. Like I said, we did have a lot of folks say, can I just talk about voting and not talk about Joe Biden? And, for our purposes, that wasn't what we were focused on. But, I think a lot of those people probably did just talk about voting on their own anyway after that conversation. So I think it's more about understanding what folks are comfortable with and then working with them about it. I worked with an organization where we were holding key senators accountable on a specific topic. So going into the program with the influencers, we made that pretty clear that they were going to have to be pretty outspoken, if a senator was taking a specific vote to be, talking about that vote and why it was important. So I think just being really clear about, what the program is and working with the influencer on it is really important. But, they're messengers just like any other tactic, or yeah, any other tactic can be kind of crafted to the goal of the program. I think influencers, theoretically can do anything. It's really just about what they're comfortable doing. And I think, if I were building out a program, I'd probably build in some wiggle room. So if someone, was really gung ho and wanted to go really hard, against someone, we made room for that opportunity. But if they, are maybe only comfortable talking about a specific issue, kind of making room for that too.
Yeah, it makes me think of a concept we have in academia called controlled interactivity, which is the idea that campaigns, they welcome the idea of social media because it opens up their access to engage directly with supporters, but they also want to keep that message kind of controlled. And so it makes me wonder about when you're, developing a message or a story for a specific influencer, do you have any issues or experiences with them not following the message or sort of going a completely different way?
Yeah, that's a great question. Nothing really comes to mind that was like, like kind of totally off the rails or anything like that. In some programs, we were, able to provide kind of like quote unquote approval on posts. This is not Biden. This is before Biden, through some of my other work. So theoretically, we were able to account for things. And a lot of times it was more like making sure that, stats that were used, we felt comfortable with and we could, back or something like that. On the Biden campaign and during Pick, we didn't have that level of control. Our influencers were volunteers. So, we of course couldn't then say that we needed to approve their content or anything like that. So yeah, nothing comes to mind as being like totally off the rails or anything like that. But it's a good point. And I actually think the reason that Democrats in particular haven't embraced influencers, really before 2020 is because I think there's this concern about having control over the message, to your point. And I think to a degree where we've been so focused on that we haven't really thought about the flip side of that opportunity. So let's say that in this influencer program, maybe 20% of the messages were, maybe 20% off the mark or something like that. The benefit is still significant. So I think it's starting to understand that kind of math and realizing that there's so much upside to this work, even with having less control over the message, than not doing it, frankly.
Right. Yeah. Super interesting. It seems like, influencers can be used for all types of messaging. They're a net benefit. We've been talking a lot about the positives of these influencer programs, but I'm curious to hear about some of the drawbacks or challenges. So what are some of the challenges you find when trying to make these collaborations work?
Yeah, there are definitely challenges. I would say most of the challenges are that this process is still pretty manual, finding the right influencers, doing that discovery process, doing any kind of reporting, which, any organization wants to understand what they're getting right out of staff time and things like that. And it definitely takes, a lot of manpower just to manage relationships. And obviously that was true for the Biden campaign and for pick because we were a national campaign and we were running programs at significant scale. So it definitely took a lot of manpower to manage, all those relationships. I think if you're maybe, a state-based campaign or organization, obviously it would take less resources because your focus is less. But I think those are the main challenges. It's really manpower, when we're talking about developing relationships with that many people.
Yeah, and I don't know so many influencers personally, right? I'm more on the nano level, but I do imagine that these influencers are somewhat demanding in terms of you're dealing with a lot of them, but they're so focused, I think, maybe on their core audience that yeah, especially when you have a national program, maybe you can't give that sort of customized access, as we were talking about, to each individual influencer.
Yeah, definitely. It definitely made me more sympathetic to folks that do surrogate work in general. Absolutely. Yeah.
So I'm curious to get your take about these influencer programs looking at kind of like the left and right wing of American politics, because traditionally we tend to think of, celebrities being more aligned with the Democratic Party, movie stars and musicians. That leads to generally better performances at inaugurations and rallies than for Republicans. And so do you think that sort of connection between celebrities and the left sort of carries over into the influencer space as well? Or do you think that on social media, the playing field for influencers is a little bit more level, especially since we've seen a lot of conservative influencers sort of emerge from social media fame?
Yeah. I do think that Republicans have historically understood the power of influencers more than Democrats.
Hmm.
To your point, like I think of, Candace Owens and folks like that, and maybe influencers, in the broader sense of that word than what we've been talking about. But I think they're related, right? This idea of like lifting up specific personalities or again, understanding the value of external messengers. I think they've understood that more than we have. And I think, I talked a little bit about 16 and 18 previously. I do think that people in 19 and 20 really started on the Democratic side, really started to open their eyes a little bit more about this work. And I think after the success of, the programs that folks ran last year, I think this cycle, I know you were talking about it. I do think there's a ton of interest on the left in doing more influencer work, which of course I'm really excited about. We actually know, so Turning Points USA on the right, they have been paying college students, to create memes and create online communities and, you know, um, lift up certain talking points online. Like they've been doing that for years. So I think it's been really interesting to kind of, I think, utilize those examples on the right as a a reason for us to start focusing on it on our side also. But I'm really thrilled, like I said, with the progress that we've made last year, and then I think the interest that I see this year going into the midterms. And a lot of my Biden colleagues in the White House, they're continuing to utilize influencers too, especially around the issue of like COVID vaccine and developing trust around the vaccine. So I'm really thrilled about I think where this industry is moving.
Definitely. And That dovetails very nicely into my last question, which has to do with the staying power of these influencers. With the amount of manpower it takes to cultivate these influencer programs, I assume it'd be beneficial to maintain these relationships over time. So you've worked with influencer programs for the electoral campaign, but also for the inauguration. Are there differences in how partnerships work during something, electoral versus non-electoral, such as thinking of non-electoral like the inauguration, or as you're mentioning about COVID vaccines, or building public support around an agenda?
Yeah. I think programmatically, the programs like structurally are probably pretty similar, the way that you're approaching those things. But I think there's more opportunity when we're talking about specific issue campaigns or something nonpartisan, like we're talking about with the COVID vaccine. So my hope is that that would mean that even more influencers are open to that kind of work, and that we're seeing even more people talking publicly about these issues on their profiles, and organizations tapping into that. So, yeah, I think there's a ton of opportunity.
Definitely. I mean, I think from what I gather from this conversation, it's really an open playbook in terms of how these influencers can be used. And it will be exciting to see in the midterms and beyond how campaigns and also incumbents use influencers to support their agenda. So, Madeline, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your insights with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I could talk about this all day.
I've just been speaking with Madeline Twomey, president at Rufus in Maine. Be sure to check the episode description for the link to the Medium post we discussed in the episode. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next time, I'll be speaking with Yeva Chesnulaitite, policy analyst from the OECD, to talk about how citizen deliberative processes can be moved online. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Pacetta, signing off from Elmo. See you next time.